The room fell completely silent before King Charles could say a single word. A folded legal ruling rested on the table in front of him, and its final sentence was impossible to ignore. Camilla had absolutely no claim to Balmoral Estate. Not a partial claim, not a symbolic one, zero claim. In that instant, the estate most closely connected to Queen Elizabeth's memory became the center of a painful conflict where love, legacy, and royal duty collided before a devastated king. Before we reveal what this decision could truly mean for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you never miss our latest royal updates. Charles stared at the judgment as though every word carried a personal betrayal. Inside Clarence House, where the monarchy quietly handles its most sensitive affairs, the atmosphere suddenly felt heavier than ever. The ruling spoke without emotion, but its meaning struck at the heart of the royal family. According to the judges, Camilla held no legal claim to Balmoral Estate, the treasured Scottish residence forever tied to Queen Elizabeth. Balmoral had never been just another royal home. It was where the late Queen spent her final days, where Charles learned the true weight of duty, loss, and responsibility. Charles, his mother, hadn't simply left treasured memories. She had also left clear boundaries. She had drawn a firm line between marriage, royal title, and inheritance. And now that line stood before him like a door that could never be opened. Charles tried to speak, but the words refused to come. His voice failed him before he could finish a sentence. Camilla watched the pain on his face and realized he wasn't grieving over land or property. He was grieving because Balmoral had revealed a truth that even the king could not change. Queen Elizabeth had already made her final decision, and not even Charles had the power to undo it. But before the palace could fully understand the impact of the ruling, it would first have to face the people whose lives had been changed by it forever. This wasn't simply a legal setback for Camilla. It was a deeply personal blow for Charles, who had spent years trying to build a future where his wife stood fully beside him. But Balmoral was different. It carried Queen Elizabeth's memory, Prince Philip's legacy, Diana's history, William's future, and a reminder that some parts of the monarchy remained protected beyond titles alone. Charles struggled to remain composed, but the ruling had reached the part of him that was not a king, not a monarch, but simply a husband. He had spent decades facing public criticism, private resistance, and memories that never completely disappeared. Camilla had finally become queen beside him, and in almost every public way, she had earned her place. Yet Balmoral revealed the one thing she could never claim. Her title brought honor, responsibility, and ceremony, but it did not automatically grant authority over an estate protected by Queen Elizabeth's final wishes. Camilla understood that reality immediately. She slowly sat near the fireplace without saying a word. She wasn't crying or arguing. Her hands tightened around the chair as though speaking might only deepen the humiliation. Charles looked toward her and quietly admitted that he had hoped the matter would be handled privately. He believed the palace could soften the situation before anyone truly understood what the ruling meant. But his voice broke before he could finish. For a man who had spent his entire life learning how to survive public storms, this private one proved far more painful. The ruling mattered because Balmoral had never been simply about ownership. It was about belonging. For Charles, it represented childhood memories, his mother's final years, and the enormous responsibility of becoming king after her passing. For Camilla, it had now become the place where the limits of her position were written into legal history. She could stand beside Charles at state banquets, national ceremonies, and official events. But this decision proved there were still parts of royal life protected by bloodline, tradition, and Queen Elizabeth's final instructions. William was informed of the ruling before most members of the royal household. That single detail changed everything inside the palace. He didn't need to make speeches or issue public statements. His early involvement quietly suggested that the decision strengthened his future responsibility over the late Queen's most protected legacy. Soon afterward, Catherine's name also appeared in internal discussions as someone expected to help preserve Queen Elizabeth's memory at Balmoral. Camilla noticed it immediately. So did Charles. This was no longer only about what his wife had lost. It had become about whom Queen Elizabeth had trusted to protect what she left behind. And as palace officials looked deeper into the documents, one forgotten moment from years earlier began to explain why the judges had reached this remarkable decision. Long before the judges delivered their ruling, one quiet evening at Balmoral had already changed everything. It wasn't a public event, a royal ceremony, or a headline-making appearance. It was a private family dinner behind closed doors where Queen Elizabeth heard a single request that would shape the estate's future. From that evening onward, Balmoral was no longer just a cherished royal retreat. It became protected ground. Camilla had never intended to create controversy, but the words she spoke carried far greater weight than she realized. During a family conversation at Balmoral, she quietly asked whether members of her own family might one day be allowed to use one of the private lodges on the estate during summer visits. To most people, it sounded like an innocent request. Inside the monarchy, however, nothing connected to Balmoral was ever simple. The estate represented history, inheritance, and Queen Elizabeth's deepest sense of duty. The late Queen listened carefully without interrupting. Charles gently tried to explain that it was simply a practical family arrangement, hoping his mother would see Camilla as part of the future rather than an outsider. But Queen Elizabeth immediately understood the larger issue. A private lodge wasn't merely accommodation. It represented access. And access could eventually become expectation. Expectation could one day become entitlement. Once that boundary disappeared, protecting Balmoral's future would become far more difficult. The Queen quietly placed her spoon on the table before looking directly at Charles. Balmoral belongs to continuity, not convenience. Her calm words filled the room with silence. Charles immediately sensed the discomfort. Camilla felt as though the Queen had rejected far more than a simple request. She had made it clear that marriage to the king would never automatically unlock every part of the royal family's most protected legacy. No one argued. No one raised their voice. The silence itself carried the message. Later that evening, Queen Elizabeth privately instructed one of her senior secretaries to place Balmoral's future arrangements into official written records so there could never be uncertainty after her passing. That single conversation quietly became the foundation for everything that followed. Years later, when those documents reached the judges, they were no longer simple notes from the past. They had become powerful evidence of Queen Elizabeth's final intentions. Charles realized then that the ruling hadn't truly begun inside a courtroom. It had begun years earlier at his mother's table, with one request, one answer, and one boundary that no one had ever been meant to cross. The confrontation that followed did not take place inside a courtroom. It happened within the palace itself, where grief, loyalty, and family history finally collided. Charles asked everyone to leave the room.
No advisors, no secretaries, no lawyers.
Only the king and Camilla remained, facing the ruling that had exposed the one part of royal life where love carried no legal authority. Charles slowly admitted that Balmoral's protected status could not be changed by his personal wishes. Even as king, he could not erase the instructions Queen Elizabeth had left behind. He had always believed that becoming monarch would allow him to shield Camilla from the wounds of the past. Instead, this decision proved that some boundaries had been placed beyond even his reach. After a long silence, Camilla finally looked at him. She quietly asked, "Did you already know?" Not loudly. Not angrily. Just with the quiet pain of someone afraid of the answer. Did Charles know that Queen Elizabeth had left instructions which could prevent her from ever having a claim to Balmoral? Charles tried to answer, but his hesitation revealed more than his words ever could. The pause lasted only a few seconds. Yet for Camilla, it changed everything. She saw the uncertainty in his eyes. Charles realized she had noticed it. Suddenly, the room was no longer carrying only the weight of the judge's decision. It carried years of unspoken doubt. Unable to hide his emotions any longer, Charles stepped away from the table and walked toward the window. He quietly wiped away tears before turning back. His voice trembled as he admitted that he had truly believed time would heal old divisions. He thought years of public service, acceptance, and loyalty would eventually soften the boundaries Queen Elizabeth had protected so carefully. But the ruling had done the opposite. It had turned those boundaries into permanent history. Camilla finally understood the deepest meaning behind the judgment. Queen Elizabeth's final wishes had become stronger than the living king's desire to protect his own wife. That was the wound no royal title could ever erase. She could wear the crown, attend every state occasion, and stand beside Charles before the world. Yet Balmoral would always remain beyond her reach. Just as the conversation seemed to reach its emotional end, a firm knock echoed through the room. Charles slowly looked toward the door. William had arrived. And in that moment, the issue stopped being about what Camilla had lost. It became about who would now protect Queen Elizabeth's most treasured legacy. William entered the room without raising his voice or showing any emotion. That quiet confidence made his presence even more powerful. Charles looked at his eldest son, while Camilla understood immediately that the conversation had entered a new phase. William had already been informed of the judge's decision, and he made it clear that Queen Elizabeth's final instructions deserved to be respected. This was no longer simply about family feelings. It was about protecting the legacy she had deliberately preserved for future generations. Charles listened carefully, hoping his son might leave room for compromise. Instead, William calmly explained that Balmoral could never become a matter of personal preference. It had always belonged to the continuity of the monarchy, not to individual wishes or changing family circumstances. Every word landed heavily inside the room. Charles wasn't hurt because William challenged him. He was hurt because his son was honoring Queen Elizabeth's final decision. That made the truth impossible to argue with. Camilla remained silent throughout the conversation. She wasn't expecting sympathy anymore. She simply realized that William had no intention of changing the ruling, regardless of the emotional consequences. He never questioned her position as queen consort. He never spoke disrespectfully. But he also made it clear that Queen Elizabeth's wishes would remain untouched. At that moment, Camilla understood that Balmoral had become a responsibility the next generation was prepared to defend. A senior legal advisor then entered with one final explanation. The judges had ruled that Balmoral would continue to follow Queen Elizabeth's private estate instructions. Marriage, royal title, or personal relationships could not alter those legal boundaries. Charles slowly lowered his head. He finally understood that the decision wasn't directed against Camilla personally. It was about protecting a legacy Queen Elizabeth had carefully planned long before her passing. The meeting quietly came to an end. Camilla rose without saying another word. Charles watched her leave the room. William remained standing exactly where he was. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Yet before the palace could begin moving forward, another series of decisions would reshape life inside the royal household, and their consequences would be felt almost immediately. By that evening, the atmosphere inside the palace had completely changed. Private meetings replaced public schedules. Senior aides quietly reviewed internal records, while legal advisors worked through Queen Elizabeth's final estate instructions once again. Camilla withdrew from the public areas of the palace and spent several hours alone. She had faced criticism throughout the years, but this situation felt different. This wasn't public opinion or newspaper headlines. It was an official ruling supported by Queen Elizabeth's own documented wishes. Charles remained inside his office, unable to focus on anything else. The legal papers still rested on his desk. Every page reminded him that Balmoral had never truly been his to give. He had hoped that love, loyalty, and time would eventually heal old divisions. Instead, the ruling proved that some royal traditions were never meant to change. Meanwhile, palace officials quietly updated internal procedures connected to Balmoral. Future access requests would now follow even stricter approval rules, ensuring that Queen Elizabeth's instructions remained fully protected. Staff members noticed another important detail. William's office appeared completely prepared for the outcome. There was no confusion. Everything suggested that the Prince of Wales had anticipated the ruling long before it became public. Charles couldn't ignore what that implied. His eldest son wasn't simply reacting to the judge's decision. He was already preparing to safeguard the future of the monarchy exactly as Queen Elizabeth had intended. As night fell over the palace, Charles requested one final private meeting with William.
No advisors. No lawyers.
No members of the household. Just father and son. He knew the next conversation would not be about legal documents or Balmoral itself. It would be about the future of the monarchy, and whether the family could still move forward after everything that had happened. Charles and William met privately later that night. There were no advisors, no legal officials, and no prepared statements. For the first time since the ruling, they spoke not as king and heir, but as a father and son carrying the same burden. Charles broke the silence first. He admitted that the judgment had become far more than a legal matter. It had become a painful family wound. He confessed that he had spent years hoping his mother would eventually accept the future he had chosen with Camilla. William listened quietly before responding. He explained that protecting Balmoral was never intended to hurt Camilla. It was about honoring Queen Elizabeth's final wishes exactly as she had left them. To him, Balmoral represented more than a royal residence. It symbolized duty, continuity, and everything the late Queen had devoted her life to protecting. Charles lowered his eyes. For the first time, he stopped viewing the ruling as a personal rejection of his marriage. Instead, he began to see it as Queen Elizabeth's final effort to preserve a legacy she believed should remain untouched. The realization was painful, but it also brought him a sense of clarity he had been searching for since the judgment arrived. William quietly placed the legal papers back on the table. He told his father that the monarchy could only remain strong when personal emotions never outweighed long-standing royal responsibility. Charles didn't answer immediately. Part of him still wished things had turned out differently. But deep inside, he knew William was protecting exactly what Queen Elizabeth had entrusted to the future king. The conversation ended without anger, without argument, only with a shared understanding that some decisions were never meant to be changed. By the following morning, however, the story had already spread beyond palace walls. What had begun as a private family matter was about to become one of the biggest royal headlines in the country. By the next morning, the story had spread far beyond the palace. Newspapers, television networks, and royal commentators all focused on one headline. King Charles had accepted the judge's ruling. Across the country, people debated Queen Elizabeth's final wishes, Camilla's position, and the future of Balmoral. For many, the estate had become more than a royal residence. It had become a symbol of Queen Elizabeth's lasting legacy. Inside Clarence House, Charles quietly approved the palace's official response. The statement confirmed that the royal household respected the court's decision and remained committed to honouring Queen Elizabeth's estate arrangements exactly as they had been written. There would be no appeal, no public challenge, no attempt to change the outcome. Camilla stood beside Charles as the final documents were signed. Although deeply disappointed, she understood that the decision was now permanent. Her role as Queen Consort remained unchanged. But Balmoral would always remain protected under Queen Elizabeth's final instructions. William also received confirmation that the matter had officially come to an end. For him, the ruling had always been about preserving the legacy entrusted to him by his grandmother. Charles slowly placed the final papers back into their folder before looking out the window in silence. At last, he accepted a truth he had struggled to face. Love could shape a life, but it could not rewrite history. Queen Elizabeth had made her decision long before anyone imagined this day would come. And even as king, Charles could only honour the boundary she had chosen to leave behind. With that, Balmoral remained exactly as the late Queen intended, a lasting symbol of duty, tradition, and royal legacy. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more royal updates. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.